Did you know that for 1,000 years, knowledge was locked away, almost like a secret? What if a single invention, a clunky machine of wood and metal, shattered that lock? How could one simple device completely upend everything people thought they knew about learning, changing the world forever, starting around the 1450s? Number 10. The shocking spread of ideas. Before the rumble and clatter of the printing press, the world of ideas moved at a snail's pace. A new thought, a groundbreaking discovery, an explosive theory, these things trickled across continents like molasses. Scholars communicated through handwritten letters, painstakingly copied and dispatched by messenger or slow-moving caravans. Imagine a brilliant astronomer in Krakow making a significant observation about the stars. To share this with a colleague in Paris, he would write it down, perhaps draw a diagram. Then, a courier would embark on a weeks-long perilous journey, carrying this single precious document. If the document was lost, stolen, or damaged, the intellectual thread could be broken. Even if it arrived safely, only one copy existed. For wider dissemination, it would need to be laboriously copied by hand, a process fraught with potential errors and immense time investment. Each copy would be a unique Beckett, sometimes differing subtly from the original due to a scribe's fatigue or misunderstanding. The sheer effort involved meant that revolutionary ideas often remained confined to small circles, whispered among a few trusted minds, taking generations to seep into broader consciousness. Then came the printing press, and suddenly, the flow of information became a raging river. Johannes Gutenberg's invention, refined in Mainz during the mid-1400s, changed the scale of duplication from single units to hundreds, then thousands. What once took months for a few copies could now be achieved in days. Consider the impact on emerging scientific thought. Nicolaus Copernicus's radical heliocentric model of the universe, detailed in his monumental work De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium, published in 1543, did not have to wait for slow error-prone scribes. Printers could produce hundreds of copies of this complex, mathematical, and astronomical treatise. These copies could be shipped across Europe, reaching astronomers and mathematicians in distant universities and observatories with unprecedented speed. Copy might land in the hands of Tycho Brahe in Denmark, another with Galileo Galilei in Italy. They could independently study its arguments, check its calculations, and build upon its foundations. The collective intellectual effort, which before was hampered by isolation and slow communication, now accelerated. The detailed anatomical drawings of Andreas Vesalius in his 1543 work, De Humani Corporis Fabrica, represent another profound shift. Before the press, medical students learned anatomy primarily from ancient texts like Galen, which contained inaccuracies based on animal dissections and through limited, often fleeting human dissections. Scribes attempting to copy anatomical drawings would inevitably introduce distortions, making the illustrations less useful. But Vesalius's printed work, featuring precise woodcut illustrations, allowed students and physicians across Europe to study detailed, accurate human anatomy directly from consistent, reliable images. A doctor in England could literally see the same internal structures as a student in Padua. This visual standardization of complex scientific information was It allowed for a shared foundation of knowledge that transcended geographical boundaries. Maps, too, saw a revolution. Cartographers like Gerardus Mercator, designing his famous world map projection in 1569, could print multiple copies of their intricate charts. These maps, depicting new discoveries from voyages of exploration, could then be distributed to navigators, merchants, and other scholars. Before, maps were rare, expensive, hand-drawn artifacts, often jealously guarded and outdated quickly. With printing, new geographical knowledge could be disseminated widely, updating the collective understanding of the world's physical layout with remarkable speed. This facilitated further exploration and trade, as mariners could set sail with more accurate navigational tools. The very act of printing these maps made them more accessible, allowing more people to visualize the expanding world, fostering a broader sense of global connection and discovery. The rapid duplication of scientific papers and philosophical treatises meant that critiques, counter-arguments, and refinements could also spread swiftly. If a scholar published a new theory, others could read it, debate it, and publish their own responses, which would also be printed and distributed. This created a dynamic, rapid-fire exchange of ideas that was simply impossible in the manuscript age. The intellectual marketplace became vibrant, noisy, and fast-paced. It was no longer a quiet, solitary pursuit, but an interconnected, collaborative enterprise, even when the collaboration took the form of intense public debate. The sheer volume of printed material created a dense web of interconnected thought, allowing knowledge to build upon itself at an unprecedented rate. The isolation of the medieval scholar began to dissipate as the printed page offered a bridge across distances, forging an intellectual community that stretched across the continent and beyond. Number 9. The unstoppable religious earthquake. For centuries before the printing press, the Church held a tight grip on spiritual knowledge. The Bible, the ultimate sacred text, existed primarily in Latin. The Vulgate translation, a language understood by a select few, priests, monks, and university scholars. Ordinary people encountered Scripture through sermons, often delivered in the local language, or through stained glass windows and religious plays. Interpreting the holy text was the exclusive domain of the clergy, creating a powerful intermediary between the faithful and the divine word. Copies of the Bible were incredibly rare, hand-copied in monasteries, often beautiful illuminated manuscripts, but also costly beyond the reach of almost everyone. A single Bible could take a scribe years to complete, making it a priceless treasure, literally chained to a pulpit in many churches to prevent theft. This scarcity and language barrier meant that the Church's interpretation was largely unquestioned, a single voice guiding the spiritual lives of millions. Then came the printing press, and with it a tidal wave of religious texts. While the Gutenberg Bible, completed around 1455, was still a luxury item, its very existence heralded a shift. It was a standardized, meticulously crafted Latin Bible, far more uniform than any scribe could produce. Truly revolutionary shift came when printers started producing Bibles not just in Latin but in vernacular languages, the everyday tongues of ordinary people. Martin Luther's translation of the New Testament into German in 1522, followed by the complete German Bible in 1534, became a monumental achievement in this regard. These printed German Bibles, more accessible in language and eventually in price, allowed common folk to read the Scriptures for themselves. A farmer in Saxony, a merchant in Nuremberg, or a weaver in Cologne could now sit and read the Gospels or the Psalms in their own tongue. This direct access undermined the clergy's monopoly on interpretation. If individuals could read God's Word for themselves, they could form their own understanding, sometimes different from the official church teachings. The 95 Theses, penned by Martin Luther in 1517, became an overnight sensation thanks to the printing press. What began as an academic challenge intended for scholarly debate was quickly translated from Latin into German, printed and distributed widely. Within weeks, copies of Luther's Objections to Indulgences were circulating throughout Germany. This short, potent document, detailing challenges to papal authority and church practices, reached thousands of people who might never have heard of it otherwise. It was a call to discussion that turned into a clarion call for reform. The printing press allowed Luther's message, and the messages of other reformers like John Calvin and Huldrych Zwingli, to spread with unprecedented speed and reach across Europe. Their theological arguments, once confined to academic circles, became subjects of public discourse. Beyond Bibles and theological treatises, the printing press also churned out countless pamphlets, sermons, and catechisms. These smaller, cheaper printed works were easily distributed and consumed. They debated theological points, satirized religious opponents, and explained new doctrines in simple terms. A single pamphlet could carry a specific religious argument or condemnation to hundreds of towns and villages, influencing public opinion and stirring religious fervor. Printing press became a powerful tool for propaganda, allowing both reformers and the established church to disseminate their views rapidly and widely, created a constant shifting battleground of ideas, fought on paper. The very act of printing these diverse viewpoints meant that religious uniformity, once maintained by scarcity and control of information, became increasingly difficult to enforce. This flood of religious literature forced the Church to respond. The Council of Trent, which convened from 1545 to 1563, was in part a reaction to the challenges posed by the Reformation, which had been so effectively amplified by printing. The Church recognized the power of the press and eventually used it to counter Protestant arguments, producing its own catechisms, prayer books, and theological works. The printing press did not simply spread Protestantism. It facilitated a continent-wide, multi-sided religious conversation and conflict. It brought theological debate out of monastic libraries and into town squares, fundamentally altering the relationship between the individual, the church, and the divine word. The landscape of religious education and practice was irrevocably transformed, moving from a single authoritative voice to a cacophony of printed arguments, allowing individuals to seek their own spiritual path, guided by the words on a page. Number 8. Books for everyone. Well, more people. In the medieval world, books were not common objects. They were rare, precious, and often considered almost sacred. Before the printing press, every book was a unique manuscript, hand-copied by scribes primarily in monasteries or university scriptoria. Creation of a single book could take months, sometimes even years, depending on its length and complexity. This meant books were astronomically expensive, far beyond the reach of common folk. Even wealthy nobles or university professors might only own a handful of books, often cherished as family heirlooms. Libraries were sparse, typically found only in large monasteries, cathedrals, or the oldest universities, where books were literally chained to shelves to prevent theft, highlighting their immense value and scarcity. The concept of personal book ownership, or books being easily accessible in a community, was largely alien. Knowledge resided primarily in people's heads, in oral traditions, or in these few guarded manuscript collections. The printing press began to dismantle this scarcity. While early printed books, like Gutenberg's Bible, were still quite expensive, the process of mass production gradually drove down costs. Printer could produce hundreds of copies of a text in the time it took a scribe to produce one. This fundamental change in production methods meant that books, while still not cheap, became significantly more affordable for a wider segment of society. Suddenly, it became possible for merchants, lawyers, prosperous artisans, and even some members of the middling classes to acquire a personal library. These weren't grand collections, perhaps a few dozen volumes, but the very existence of these individual collections was a radical departure. Books were no longer just items of communal or institutional prestige. They were becoming personal tools for learning and entertainment. Printing also spurred the growth of booksellers and publishers. Before, the press book trade was limited, often bespoke orders for individual manuscripts. Now, printing shops often doubled as sales outlets, and dedicated booksellers began to emerge in major cities like Venice, Paris, and London. These booksellers acted as conduits, connecting printers with readers across broader geographic areas. They created catalogs, advertised new titles, and facilitated the distribution of printed works. The establishment of these commercial networks meant that books could travel further and be found more easily by those who sought them. This commercialization of knowledge was a new phenomenon, transforming books from rare treasures into marketable commodities. As more books were printed and sold, the idea of a public library began to take root, though not in the modern sense. Early forms included private collections that were occasionally made accessible to scholars, or university libraries that saw their holdings grow exponentially. For instance, the Bodleian Library at Oxford University, established in 1602, benefited immensely from the output of the printing press, rapidly accumulating a vast collection of printed works. While access was still restricted, the sheer volume of available material meant that these institutions could offer a much broader range of subjects and perspectives than ever before. Books were no longer chained, as much for fear of theft as for ease of organization within these growing collections. The shift in book ownership also led to a change in the social status of books. Owning books became a sign of intellectual curiosity, wealth, and status, but it also implied engagement with the world of ideas. Scholars could build their own reference libraries, allowing them to conduct research and study more independently. Students could acquire their own textbooks rather than relying solely on lecture notes or shared limited manuscript copies. This burgeoning private ownership fostered a culture of individual reading and study, moving away from a purely communal experience of learning. Printed book became a tangible symbol of intellectual progress, no longer an inaccessible luxury, but a commodity that, while still valuable, was within reach of a growing number of intellectually hungry individuals across Europe. The very fabric of intellectual exchange shifted from exclusive monastic cloisters to the bustling shops of printers and booksellers, and eventually into the private studies of an expanding intellectual class. Number 7. Breaking the Latin language barrier. For centuries, the intellectual world of Europe largely spoke Latin. It was the language of scholarship, theology, law, and government. University lectures were delivered in Latin, legal documents were drafted in Latin, and the Bible, the ultimate source of spiritual authority, existed predominantly in its Latin Vulgate translation. If you wanted to engage with serious knowledge, you needed to master Latin. This created a significant barrier. Only a small, educated elite, primarily clergy and university-trained men, possessed the linguistic skills to access the most important texts and participate in intellectual discourse. The vast majority of the population, including merchants, artisans, and farmers, spoke only their local vernacular, their everyday language like English, German, French, or Italian. This language divide effectively segregated society into those with access to formal knowledge and those without, confining intellectual life to a narrow stratum. The printing press, however, began to chip away at this formidable language barrier. While many early printed books were indeed in Latin, particularly academic and religious texts, printers quickly realized there was a vast, untapped market for books in everyday languages. People wanted to read stories, practical guides, news, and even religious texts in a language they understood without needing a translator or a university degree. This commercial demand led to an explosion of printing in vernacular languages. Suddenly, works of literature that had existed in manuscript form, like Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales in English or Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy in Italian, could be printed in multiple copies, making them widely available. This meant that a merchant in London could read about the wife of Bath's adventures, or a Florentine baker could immerse himself in Dante's journey through the Inferno without needing to know a word of Latin. This shift was not just about entertainment. It had profound implications for education and the spread of knowledge. Practical manuals on everything from farming techniques to metallurgy, from navigation to arithmetic, began to appear in vernaculars. Craftsman could now buy a printed book explaining new methods or designs in his own language, allowing him to improve his skills or learn new trades without needing a Latin-speaking tutor. Legal documents and local statutes, which had previously been confined to Latin, began to be printed in the common tongue, allowing ordinary citizens a clearer understanding of the laws that governed their lives. This was a democratization of practical knowledge. The printing of Bibles in vernacular languages, as seen with Martin Luther's German Bible, was perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of this trend. For the first time, individuals could directly engage with the sacred texts in their own language, fostering a more personal and immediate relationship with religious doctrine. This accessibility fueled the Reformation, as people could compare what they read in their vernacular Bibles with the teachings of the Church, often leading to questioning and dissent. The theological debates, once confined to Latin-speaking scholars, now permeated society, discussed in homes and taverns across Europe. The rise of printing in vernacular languages also played a significant role in the standardization and development of these languages themselves. When texts were hand-copied, regional variations in spelling, grammar, and vocabulary were common. Printing, by producing identical copies, encouraged greater consistency. Printer producing an English book would use a relatively standardized form of English, helping to solidify spelling and grammar conventions across different regions. This process contributed to the eventual formation of national languages and literary traditions. Authors like William Shakespeare writing in English found a much larger audience due to the existence of a robust printing industry supporting vernacular literature. Printing press effectively built bridges between different social strata and across linguistic divides, making knowledge accessible to a much wider audience and fundamentally changing who could participate in the intellectual life of Europe. The world was no longer exclusively speaking Latin. It was learning to speak, read, and think in a multitude of native tongues. Number 6. New ways to learn. No more monks only. In the medieval university, learning was a deeply communal and highly structured affair. The professor, typically a cleric, held immense authority as the primary conduit of knowledge. Students learned by listening to lectures, often delivered in Latin, which involved the professor reading aloud from a single authoritative text, usually a manuscript. Students meticulously took notes, copying down passages or interpretations, as individual textbooks were rare and prohibitively expensive. The emphasis was on memorization, recitation, and scholastic disputation, formal debates where students defended or challenged established arguments. The master's interpretation of a text was paramount, and students were expected to absorb and reproduce this understanding. Knowledge flowed vertically, from the authoritative teacher to the receptive student, with little opportunity for independent exploration beyond the prescribed curriculum. The educational experience was tightly controlled, designed to transmit established truths and maintain intellectual conformity within the confines of church dogma. Printing press began to subtly, yet profoundly, shift this pedagogical landscape. Suddenly, multiple identical copies of texts became available. Students could acquire their own printed books, even if they were still a significant investment. This simple fact revolutionized the learning process. Instead of solely relying on the professor's recitation and their own hasty notes, students could now read the primary text themselves, at their own pace, in their own rooms. They could reread difficult passages, cross-reference different sections, and ponder the arguments independently. This fostered a new culture of silent individual study, a stark contrast to the primarily auditory and communal learning environment of the past. Printed book became a personal tutor, available at any hour. This newfound access to multiple texts also challenged the singular authority of the professor. Before, if a student wanted to consult another interpretation of Aristotle or a different theological argument, they had to seek out another scarce manuscript, a difficult task. With printing, students could potentially acquire several different commentaries on the same text, or even original works by different authors presenting contrasting viewpoints. This allowed students to compare and contrast arguments, to critically evaluate different interpretations, and to form their own informed opinions. The role of the professor began to evolve. They were no longer the sole fount of knowledge, but rather guides who helped students navigate the growing ocean of printed information, teaching them how to analyze, synthesize, and critique the wealth of available texts. The curriculum itself slowly began to broaden. As more diverse texts became available, universities found it increasingly difficult to maintain a narrow focus on traditional scholastic subjects. New ideas in science, medicine, and philosophy, previously confined to a few isolated manuscripts, now proliferated in print. Professors might introduce these new printed works into their lectures, or students, having read them independently, might challenge traditional teachings. This intellectual ferment pushed the boundaries of what was considered acceptable knowledge. For example, a student reading an independently acquired copy of Vesalius's anatomy book might approach a lecture on Galen with new questions or observations based on the printed anatomical drawings, fostering a more dynamic and questioning learning environment. Furthermore, the very act of printing encouraged a more standardized curriculum across different universities, yet simultaneously allowed for greater individual specialization. While a core set of texts might be adopted widely, the availability of a broader range of books meant that students could delve deeper into specific areas of interest, pursuing knowledge beyond the common curriculum. This facilitated the emergence of specialized scholarly fields. The shift was gradual but undeniable. Education moved from a system dominated by oral transmission and limited authoritative texts to one that embraced individual reading, critical comparison of sources, and a burgeoning intellectual independence. The monastic monopoly on knowledge gave way to a more distributed, decentralized, and ultimately more dynamic pursuit of learning. Number 5. The end of just listening. For centuries, medieval education was profoundly oral. Learning happened largely through the spoken word and communal recitation. In monasteries, monks gathered to listen to scriptures read aloud, to chant psalms, and to engage in communal prayers. In universities, professors delivered lectures by speaking directly from scarce manuscripts, often reading the text aloud and then elaborating. Students learned by listening intently, memorizing what was said, and then reciting it back. Debates were spoken, arguments were articulated verbally, and knowledge was primarily transmitted through sound. A scholar's reputation often rested on their ability to command an audience with eloquence and a masterful memory. The very act of reading, for many, involved vocalizing the words even when alone, as silent reading was not a widespread practice. The world was an echo chamber of spoken knowledge, where the ear was the primary gateway to learning. The arrival of the printing press, quietly yet decisively, began to change this auditory landscape. With multiple identical copies of texts now available, individuals could acquire their own books. This made silent, private reading not only possible, but increasingly common. Instead of waiting for a lecture or a communal reading, a student could now sit alone with a printed volume and absorb information at their own pace. Could pause, reread, reflect, and engage with the text without the need for external prompting or the distraction of others. This shift from an auditory culture to a more visual one was fundamental. The eye became the new primary gateway to knowledge, and the silent, solitary act of reading became a powerful new mode of learning. This change had significant implications for cognitive processes. Memorization, while still important, became less about rote recall of spoken words and more about comprehension and critical analysis of printed text. Learners could now easily refer back to a printed page to verify facts or arguments, rather than relying solely on their memory of a lecture. The ability to physically highlight passages, make marginal notes, a practice that exploded with printed books, and dog-ear pages allowed for a more active and personalized engagement with the material. Learning became less about passively receiving information and more about actively constructing understanding through individual interaction. With the printed word, the classroom environment itself also began to evolve. While lectures remained important, the role of the professor shifted. With students having access to the texts themselves, professors could spend less time simply reading aloud and more time on discussion, interpretation, and problem solving. Debates could be supported by students referring directly to specific passages in their own books. This fostered a more dynamic and interactive learning experience, moving beyond the traditional model of a single authority dictating knowledge to a receptive audience. The focus moved from the performance of the speaker to the content of the text itself. Beyond formal education, the rise of silent reading had a broader cultural impact. People began to read for pleasure, for personal growth, and for private contemplation in a way that was difficult before. This fostered a more introspective relationship with knowledge and stories. Image of the solitary reader absorbed in a printed book became increasingly common, a stark contrast to the communal gatherings around a speaker or a shared manuscript. This subtle shift in how people consumed information, from listening to silent reading, laid the groundwork for modern study habits and fundamentally altered the landscape of personal and academic intellectual engagement. Printing press did not eliminate oral tradition overnight, but it offered a powerful alternative, empowering the eye and the individual mind in a way that the ear alone could not. Number 4. So many books, so many new ideas. For most of the medieval period, the university curriculum was rigidly defined. The dominant subjects were theology, law, and medicine, with philosophy, primarily Aristotelian scholasticism, and rhetoric serving as foundational disciplines. Knowledge was often viewed as a fixed body of inherited wisdom, transmitted and interpreted through generations. Innovation was often viewed with suspicion, and new ideas had to fit within established frameworks, typically those sanctioned by the church or classical authorities like Galen in medicine and Aristotle in natural philosophy. Textbooks were scarce, expensive, and often ancient, hand-copied over centuries, ensuring that new discoveries or perspectives struggled to find their way into mainstream academic discourse. If a new idea emerged, it faced an uphill battle to be copied, disseminated, and accepted, often remaining confined to a few specialist circles. The printing press utterly disrupted this static intellectual environment. Suddenly, the cost and effort of producing books plummeted, leading to a massive increase in the sheer volume and diversity of printed material. This explosion of available texts meant that new subjects and disciplines which had previously been marginalized or non-existent in formal education could now flourish. Works that challenged traditional views or explored entirely new fields of inquiry could be printed and distributed relatively easily. This allowed for the rapid growth of areas like anatomy, botany, cartography, engineering, and mathematics, often with a renewed emphasis on observation and experimentation. Consider the field of medicine. For centuries, the teachings of the ancient Greek physician Galen, often based on animal dissections, were the unchallenged authority. With the printing press, detailed and accurate anatomical atlases like Andreas Vesalius's De Humani Corporis Fabrica, 1543, could be produced. These books featured intricate woodcut illustrations of the human body, based on actual human dissection. Students and physicians could now see, in print, the precise structures of the human body, often revealing discrepancies with Galen's long-held theories. This printed visual information was powerful. It allowed for a standardized and widespread understanding of human anatomy that accelerated medical knowledge far beyond what could be achieved by limited dissections and oral transmission. It sparked a revolution in medical education, shifting it towards empirical observation. In botany, Printed herbals with accurate illustrations became common. Before the press, plant identification relied on descriptions that were often vague or artistic, renderings that were inaccurate in manuscripts. With printing, botanists could disseminate detailed, consistent illustrations of plants, aiding in identification, medicinal applications, and a classification of species. Similarly, in cartography, newly explored lands and sea routes could be quickly incorporated into new, updated maps. These maps, printed in multiple copies, became essential tools for navigators, merchants, and even armchair explorers, rapidly changing the world's perceived geography and fueling further voyages of discovery. The development of new mathematical texts and treatises, often translated from Arabic or Greek, also gained immense traction through printing. These books, detailing advancements in algebra, geometry, and trigonometry, became accessible to a wider audience of scholars, engineers, and merchants. New engineering diagrams and architectural plans could be printed, allowing for the widespread dissemination of new construction techniques and designs. Printing press facilitated the cross-pollination of ideas between practical crafts and theoretical knowledge. Artisans could learn from printed manuals, and scholars could gain insights from detailed technical drawings. This explosion of new knowledge areas meant that universities slow to adapt eventually had to broaden their curricula. While theology and law remained central, the undeniable advancements in fields like astronomy, Copernicus's De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium, printed in 1543, anatomy and cartography began to demand inclusion. New professorships might be established, or existing disciplines might incorporate the latest printed findings. Printing press was not just a tool for copying old knowledge, it was an engine for generating and disseminating entirely new fields of inquiry, fundamentally expanding the intellectual horizons of European education and paving the way for the scientific revolution. The world was no longer simply interpreting established texts. It was actively discovering and documenting new dimensions of reality. Number 3. Goodbye, scribe. Hello, perfection. Before the printing press, every single book was a unique, handwritten manuscript. Scribes, working in monasteries or university scriptoria, painstakingly copied texts word by word, line by line. This process, while often producing beautiful works of art, was inherently prone to error. A tired scribe might misread a word, skip a line, or inadvertently substitute one phrase for another. Over generations of copying, these small errors could accumulate, leading to significant variations between different manuscript copies of the same text. Imagine trying to learn from two different textbooks on the same subject, only to find that key facts, philosophical arguments, or even biblical verses differed wildly depending on which version you were holding. This lack of standardization created confusion, hindered accurate scholarship, and made reliable learning a constant challenge. There was no single definitive version of many important works, and verifying information often involved comparing multiple conflicting manuscripts. The printing press brought an unprecedented level of standardization to texts. Once a printer set the type for a page, every single impression pulled from that type was identical. If an error was discovered during the proofreading process, it could be corrected on the type block, and all subsequent copies would be correct. This meant that thousands of copies of a book could be produced, all containing the exact same words, punctuation, and even page numbering. For the first time in history, scholars across Europe could refer to the same edition of a classical work, a legal code, or a religious text, confident that they were all looking at the exact same information. This consistency was a game changer for education and scholarship. Consider the impact on classical texts. Ancient Greek and Roman authors whose works had been preserved through centuries of manuscript copying often existed in a chaotic array of different versions, riddled with scribble errors and intentional alterations. Early humanists, dedicated to restoring these texts to their original purity, had a monumental task. Printing press provided the ultimate tool for this endeavor. Scholars like Desiderius Erasmus, working in the early 16th century, painstakingly collated multiple manuscripts of the Greek New Testament. He then had his definitive edition printed in 1516, which became a foundational text for subsequent Bible translations and scholarly study. Printed edition provided a stable, widely accessible version that scholars everywhere could trust and work from. Errors that persisted in one print run could be corrected in the next, leading to increasingly accurate editions over time. This standardization also had profound implications for legal and religious education. Legal codes, which had been prone to local variations in manuscript form, could now be printed uniformly. A lawyer in Paris and a judge in Florence could refer to the same printed version of Roman law or canon law. This fostered a more consistent application of legal principles across different regions. In religious education, the printing of standardized Bibles both in Latin and eventually in vernacular languages meant that theological debates could be conducted with reference to a common agreed-upon source. Arguments no longer devolved into disputes about the accuracy of a particular manuscript copy. Instead, they could focus on the interpretation of a universally available text. Furthermore, the uniformity of printed books facilitated easier reference and cross-referencing. Page, numbers, indices, and tables of contents, which were difficult to implement effectively in unique manuscripts, became standard features in printed books. Professor could assign a reading from page 75 of a particular edition, knowing that every student with that edition would find the exact same passage. This made teaching and learning far more efficient. The ability to compare arguments across different texts also became simpler, as scholars could be confident they were comparing stable, unchanging versions of each work. Printing press did not just make books cheaper, it made them reliable, establishing a foundation of textual stability upon which modern scholarship and education could truly begin to build. Number 2. Books everywhere, but not really for everyone yet. In the long centuries before the printing press, literacy was a rare and specialized skill. The ability to read and write was largely confined to specific groups: the clergy, who needed to read scripture and liturgical texts, wealthy nobles, who might employ scribes and tutors, and a small percentage of murdercy for their trade. For the vast majority of the population, farmers, laborers, artisans, literacy was neither necessary nor accessible. Education was primarily oral, learned through apprenticeship, storytelling, and communal religious practice. Books, being hand-copied and immensely expensive, were simply not part of their world. The idea of mass literacy was unfathomable, a distant dream in a society where knowledge was primarily heard, not read. The invention of the printing press did not cause an immediate dramatic explosion of literacy rates across Europe. It was a gradual process, but the press certainly provided the fuel for that eventual fire. The immediate impact was that books became more accessible, even if still relatively costly for common folk. Printers produced not only weighty academic tomes, but also cheaper, smaller, and more accessible materials. Think of the widespread printing of pamphlets, broadsides, ballads, and short devotional texts. These were often sold for a few pennies, making them affordable for a much wider segment of the population. A traveling peddler might carry a bundle of these printed sheets, spreading news, moral tales, or religious arguments to towns and villages far from major print centers. This proliferation of cheaper, varied printed materials created a powerful incentive for people to learn to read. If you could read, you could access news about current events, follow religious debates, learn practical skills from a printed manual, or simply enjoy a story. For some, literacy became a pathway to social mobility or economic advantage. A merchant's apprentice who could read and write might be more valuable to his master. Craftsmen who could read technical diagrams in a printed book might gain an edge over his competitors. The availability of reading material acted as a constant, subtle encouragement for individuals to acquire this new and increasingly useful skill. Printers also played a direct role in fostering literacy by producing educational materials. ABC, books, primers, and grammar guides, previously rare and expensive, could now be printed in large quantities. These basic educational tools became more available to parents, local teachers, and even self-learners. While formal schooling remained limited for many, these printed primers allowed for a more widespread, albeit informal, acquisition of reading skills. Religious movements, particularly during the Reformation, also heavily promoted literacy. Protestants encouraged adherents to read the Bible for themselves, leading to a surge in demand for vernacular Bibles and, by extension, a greater emphasis on teaching basic reading skills within families and communities. While widespread literacy for the entire population would not be achieved for centuries, the printing press laid the essential groundwork. It shifted the economic and social calculus of reading. No longer was literacy solely for the elite or the clergy. It became a valuable skill for a broader range of citizens. The sheer volume of printed material created a literacy-rich environment that slowly but surely began to chip away at the centuries-old wall of illiteracy. It cultivated a reading public, eager for information and entertainment, thus gradually increasing the demand for educational opportunities and encouraging more people to step into the world of the written word. The gate was cracked open, and though not everyone could rush through at once, the path was clear for many to follow. Number 1. The gates of knowledge cracked open. For most of the medieval period, knowledge was a treasure, locked away. Books were incredibly rare and shockingly expensive. Each copy was a unique, labor-intensive creation, meticulously hand-copied by scribes. A single substantial book, like a Bible or a scholarly treatise, could take a skilled scribe a year or more to complete. This made books luxury items, often costing more than a house or a farm. Consequently, access to written knowledge was severely restricted. University libraries possessed only a handful of copies of essential texts, which were often chained to reading desks to prevent theft due to their immense value. Students could not own their textbooks. They learned by listening to lectures, taking notes from the professor's recitation, or sharing limited, precious manuscripts. The vast majority of people would live their entire lives without ever seeing, let alone holding, a book. Knowledge was transmitted orally through sermons, stories, and apprenticeships, or confined to the elite few who could afford or access these handwritten rarities. The gates of recorded knowledge were largely closed, guarded by scarcity and exorbitant costs. Then came the printing press, and everything began to change. Johannes Gutenberg's revolutionary invention in the mid-15th century, capable of mass-producing identical copies of texts, began to dismantle the centuries-old barriers to knowledge. While the very first printed books, like the Gutenberg Bible, were still expensive masterpieces, the technology quickly improved, and the cost per book steadily declined. Printer could produce hundreds, then thousands of copies in a fraction of the time it took a scribe to make one. This exponential increase in production volume dramatically lowered the relative price of books, making them gradually more affordable for a wider range of people. Suddenly, books were no longer exclusive possessions of the church or the wealthiest nobles. While still a significant investment for a common person, a merchant, a prosperous artisan, or a university student could now realistically hope to own a few books. This newfound affodi cracked open the gates of knowledge. Students could now acquire their own copies of classical texts, philosophical works, or medical treatises. They could study these texts at their leisure, annotate them, and return to them repeatedly. A revolutionary concept compared to the fleeting experience of a lecture or the brief access to a shared manuscript. This individual ownership fostered a more personal and independent approach to learning. This increased accessibility also meant that books could travel further and faster. What might have been a single manuscript copy circulating within a small monastic community could now be 1,000 printed copies, distributed across multiple countries. This broad distribution of knowledge was unprecedented. Scientific discoveries, new philosophical ideas, and even challenging political tracks could reach a much wider audience, sparking debate and intellectual ferment on a scale previously unimaginable. The exchange of ideas accelerated as printed books formed a common intellectual currency. Furthermore, the types of books being printed expanded beyond the traditional academic and religious texts. Printers began to produce practical manuals on subjects like agriculture, navigation, architecture, and even popular literature like romances and songbooks. These were often printed in vernacular languages, further expanding access to knowledge for those without Latin education. A farmer could buy a printed guide on crop rotation, a sailor a book of nautical charts, or an artisan a book of designs. These practical guides empowered individuals with information that could directly improve their lives and trades, fundamentally changing who could access and benefit from recorded knowledge. Printing press thus began a slow but relentless process of democratizing knowledge. Transformed books from inaccessible luxuries into tools for learning, debate, and personal enrichment. Traditional reliance on oral tradition or highly restricted manuscript access started to erode. While true universal access to education and books was still centuries away, the initial cracking open of the gates of knowledge by the printing press set in motion a chain of events that reshaped education, empowered individual learners, and laid the foundation for the explosion of information that defines our modern world.